Hello dear friends, you are watching Ruslan Belov's channel, and this is another daily update on combat operations on the Ukrainian front. The past 24 hours have been extremely intense in terms of emotions, both because of the events themselves and the reactions they triggered. We are, of course, talking about the tanker that was sailing under the Russian flag. It was registered by Russia in mid-December, more precisely closer to the end of the month, and formally the vessel was fully formed under Russian jurisdiction and was flying the flag of the Russian Federation. Despite this, the American side boarded the ship and effectively seized it. Was this an act of blatant audacity? Without any doubt, yes. I have already commented on this in my Telegram channel, but I will repeat it here as well. In my view, such actions are directly linked to the excessive softness of the Russian authorities, to how they react, or rather how they often fail to react to such challenges. Had Russia acted more decisively on the international stage from the very beginning, back in 2022, and it is never too late to start acting tougher, the behavior of the United States and Europe would have been completely different. Such brazen actions on their part would simply not have occurred. But as long as this so-called spirit of anchorage, the spirit of Miami, remains, as long as the emphasis is placed on compromises, on the formal observance of international law and similar notions, Russia will continue to face exactly what it is facing now. The United States, frankly speaking, has no real respect for international law. It acts as it sees fit, and I am convinced that Russia, too, needs to behave far more firmly and assertively on the global stage. That concludes the emotional part. Let us move directly to the overview of the situation on the front. So, dear friends, today's episode I will begin not with ground advances, although they certainly exist, and we will definitely discuss them, but with an event that took place yesterday, closer to the evening, when for many it was already late at night. I am referring to a powerful strike by the Russian army on targets in the Dnipro region and in the Zaporizhzhia area. At first glance, there have been many such strikes recently, but this particular one proved to be so effective that the consequences are now very clear. Let us start with Dnipro. The city has effectively plunged into a complete blackout, and this is a total shutdown. There is no electricity, no water supply, no heating, no communications, no internet. The metro is not operating, suburban rail traffic has been halted, and warning systems, including air raid sirens, are also not functioning. Simply put, nothing works. This is a textbook example of a total blackout. As for Zaporizhzhia, I do not have precise information regarding communications and internet access, but it is known that electricity in the city is also completely absent. Moreover, during the night the company Ukrenergo released a statement indicating that electricity supply in Dnipro would be restored by June 2027. Of course, it was later said that this was a typo or an error, but the very fact is telling. In reality, the official position is that the timeline for restoring the infrastructure remains unknown. This once again underscores just how effective this strike was. That is precisely why I decided to start today's episode with this topic. If such strikes continue and expand in scale, then in the near future, a similar situation may develop not only in Dnipro, but also in Kharkiv, and possibly even in Kiev. Now let us move directly to the front line, to combat operations and the advances of Russian forces. I will say right away, there is not a great deal of news, since the holiday period has not yet ended, and the flow of information is limited. Nevertheless, for the third consecutive day, we are starting our review with the Kupiansk sector. If over the previous 2 days, the main news came from the city's flanks, and moreover, the information the day before yesterday was, to put it mildly, not very positive, then over the past 24 hours, reports have come directly from Kupiansk itself, and this time the news is positive. Over the past day, Russian units have managed to retake an extremely important fortified area in the central part of the city. This concerns a complex of buildings that includes the central city hospital, a maternity hospital, a clinic, as well as a number of solid structures, including a church. Control over this node had been lost back in December, but it has now been restored. As I said in yesterday's episode, when we analyzed attempts to expand control on the northern flank, a kind of light at the end of the tunnel appeared. real chances emerged that the Russian army might still be able to hold Kupiansk. Now, relying on this fortified area, and provided sufficient forces are available, it may be possible to conduct a counterattack aimed at regaining control over the private housing sector and subsequently clearing the central part of the city up to the railway line. At the same time, I must immediately note that the key question is how many forces the Russian army currently has concentrated on the right bank part of Kupiansk, and whether they are sufficient to carry out such operations. I do not have exact data on troop numbers, so I cannot give a definitive answer. However, the very fact that control over such a crucial fortified position has been restored may indicate that the necessary resources are indeed available. At the very least, we are observing a shift in the overall trend. If in mid and late December, the armed forces of Ukraine were exerting pressure and Russian units were regularly retreating, losing block after block, the situation is now different. The AFIO appear to have run out of steam. They failed to achieve their main objective, retaking Kupiansk, and are now beginning to lose stability themselves. At the same time, it is important to remember that the decisive factor remains the security of the flanks. Even in the event of a series of successful counterattacks and the full restoration of control over the right bank part of the city, holding Kupiansk without securely protected flanks and stable logistics would be impossible. And stable logistics, in turn, is only possible if the flanks are secured. That is why expanding the zone of control and pushing the line of contact away from the Oskil River is a task of primary importance, even more important than retaking individual city blocks. Let us move on. On the Lyman direction, there are no changes on the map yet, but I have information from a reliable source that I want to share with you. The farms to the north of the city are already under Russian control. As a result, Lyman is effectively being squeezed in a pincer, and the assault on the northern part of the city has already begun. At the same time, I should note that there are currently no objective control videos available, so it is too early to draw final conclusions. The information is reliable, but whether to trust it or not is up to each individual. Like you, I am also waiting for confirmation footage so that we can discuss the situation on this sector in greater detail and with more confidence. As for Dnipro, despite the fact that maps mark the settlement as being fully under Russian control, the real situation is more complicated. The armed forces of Ukraine are attempting counterattacks, and at the very least, the southern part of Dnipro is not under stable control by Russian forces. Moreover, the central part of the village also remains contested. In some areas, there is a grey zone, with positions intermingled. As a result, it must be stated that the advance toward Brusovka has currently stalled, and the cutting of the Sloviansk-Lyman highway has been postponed for the time being. On the Rye-Oleksandrivka direction, heavy fighting continues in Reznikovo. The AFU are offering stubborn resistance, and the battles here are intense. Nevertheless, despite this resistance, Russian forces continue to advance, and fighting has already shifted into the central part of the settlement. South of Siversk, Russian units continue to drive wedges into the enemy's defenses, and a pocket to the northeast of Reznikivka has been closed. Further up the front line, Russian forces are fighting for a strongpoint on a dominant height near Zakotny. Ukrainian logistics in the Kaleniaki and Kryva Luka areas are being actively targeted by artillery with the support of Rubicon drone operators. Local residents report that archival documents are being evacuated from Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, and that police and recruitment office personnel have already left Mykolaiivka. At the same time, residents of the agglomeration, which numbers around 160,000 people, are being advised to remain calm and avoid panic. On the Kostiantynivka sector, as well as in the areas of Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad, no significant changes were recorded over the past 24 hours. And there are no updates on the map. Another sector where Russian forces have made progress is the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Novopavlivka direction, which falls under the responsibility of the center grouping. Here, units managed to clear a substantial section of a so-called pocket. The width of the advance amounted to about 4.3 kilometers, with a depth of nearly 3 kilometers. The total area brought under control is estimated at around 12 square kilometers. Thanks to this advance, relatively stable control over the eastern part of Novopavlivka has been ensured. at least protecting it from potential counterattacks by the AFU. Among the immediate objectives is reaching the Muravka-Novopavlivka road. If this road is cut and the entire area is cleared, pressure on the settlement will increase significantly, and there may finally be an opportunity to force the issue, especially given the increased activity of Russian forces from the southern direction. On the Huliaipol sector, there is still no news confirmed by objective control footage. However, there is reliable information from servicemen that a fairly large-scale offensive has begun, in the sense that the width of the sector where Russian units are advancing is quite significant. I am confident that in the coming days, at most within a week, corresponding video evidence will appear. The map will be updated accordingly, and we will be able to discuss the situation in detail. For now, I can say with confidence, despite the lack of map updates, for the reasons I mentioned at the beginning, including the holiday period, the situation for the AFU on this direction is rapidly deteriorating. That concludes, dear friends, our overview of the situation on the front over the past 24 hours. The United States Navy has taken control of the Russian oil tanker Marinera, after which the White House stated that the United States intends to bring the detained crew to trial. The Russian Ministry of Transport issued an official statement, noting that on December 24, 2025, the vessel Marinera received temporary authorization to sail under the state flag of the Russian Federation. This permit was issued in full compliance with Russian legislation and the applicable norms of international law. Nevertheless, today at around 3 p.m. Moscow time, while the tanker was in the open sea outside the territorial waters of any state, units of the U.S. Navy boarded the vessel, after which contact with it was lost. The Ministry of Transport emphasized that, under the provisions of the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the principle of freedom of navigation applies on the high seas, and no state has the right to use force against vessels lawfully registered under the jurisdiction of another state. Washington, it should be recalled, linked the seizure of the Russian tanker to its policy of blocking Venezuelan oil. The situation was also commented on by the first deputy chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee, Zhuravlyov. According to him, diplomatic instruments in this case have been exhausted, and Russia must respond appropriately to what has happened. He stated that American Coast Guard boats, which found themselves thousands of kilometers away from their own shores and, in essence, have confused the waters they are operating in, are behaving provocatively. As a tough response, he did not rule out the use of force, including the possible use of torpedoes against several American Coast Guard vessels. In his view, the United States is in a state of euphoria from a sense of impunity following its operation in Venezuela, and the only way to stop it now is through a tangible and painful signal. At the same time, Senator Marco Rubio informed members of the U.S. Congress that the administration in the White House is aiming to acquire Greenland. This was reported by the Wall Street Journal, citing sources. Donald Trump and his inner circle are discussing various scenarios for a potential deal. The White House has also directly stated that the use of U.S. armed forces to achieve this objective is being considered as an acceptable option. Reuters, for its part, reminds that Greenland itself has repeatedly stated that it does not want to become part of the United States. Against this backdrop, the U.S. president stated that impeachment proceedings could once again be launched against him. He addressed Republicans in the House of Representatives, warning that if they lose the midterm elections, Democrats will restart the process of removing the head of state from office. According to him, he has already been subjected to impeachment attempts twice without sufficient grounds. And now, in his view, the same scenario is repeating itself. One possible trigger could be the U.S. operation in Venezuela, which was carried out without congressional approval. Congresswoman April Delaney publicly called for considering impeachment proceedings against Trump, citing violations of constitutional procedures and an overreach of presidential authority. International law, by and large, did not stop working today. Its foundations were undermined earlier, with Syria and Gaza destroyed and Libya torn to pieces. As long as all this concerned other countries, many preferred to avert their eyes, covering up the decay of the so-called Western civilization with talk about the interests of the Syrian, Libyan, and Iraqi peoples. However, the appetites of the world's main power players have grown, and now their ambitions are extending to areas that were previously considered untouchable. In such a situation, there is no longer time for cosmetic fixes or rhetorical flourishes. This concerns not only us. One only has to look at Greenland, whose return to the American orbit no longer looks like a mere whim of Trump. How should one respond to this? International law is increasingly giving way to the law of force, and that means that, in order to survive, one must become stronger. We already have the best army. We know how to speak firmly. This is not about carrying sacks, but a kind word combined with a powerful army, a strong economy, industry, and advanced technologies is always more effective than just a kind word alone. I wrote these thoughts a year ago. Today, I would add that anyone who has felt a sense of total impunity and absolute power must be answered sharply, without regard for past agreements. The spirit of Anchorage has completely evaporated, giving way to the stench of Caracas. With that, dear friends, I will conclude today's episode. Thank you to everyone who watched until the end, supported the channel, and stays with us. Take care of yourselves, remain calm, and keep a clear head. We will meet again very soon in the next update. Stay in touch.